Hello to all our wonderful listeners of Sci-fi stories. Unfortunately, our channel has recently been demonetized by YouTube, so we no longer have a budget to operate. If you find the story today interesting, please consider supporting us with just $1, so the channel can pay our staff for their living expenses and continue creating more stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. If someone had told me yesterday that the continued existence of the three most terrifying apex predator species in the known universe would rely entirely on a glorified galactic garbage man, I would have told them they were insane. Yet, here I am, staring down the barrels of enough firepower to vaporize a solar system, holding a basket of alien babies. I am Atticus Ball. On paper, I am a bioengineer. In reality, I am the captain of a rusted bucket of bolts, masquerading as a transport ship, hauling industrial waste straight through the middle of the Black Belt. The Black Belt is a dead zone of space where starlight goes to die, filled with rogue asteroids and the frozen carcasses of ships belonging to pilots who thought they were luckier than they actually were. I liked it here. It was quiet, and nobody bothered a trash hauler. Until today, my proximity alarms did not just beep, they screamed. I looked out the reinforced viewport and watched the absolute darkness of the void suddenly erupt with blinding distortion flares. Three massive combat fleets, representing the three most savage, merciless predator races in the galaxy, dropped out of warp space simultaneously. They surrounded my pathetic little scow. Thousands of heavily armed dreadnoughts boxed me in from every conceivable angle. They dwarfed my ship so entirely that I looked like a single speck of dust floating amidst a hurricane. Their weapon systems locked onto my hull. I waited for the inevitable flash of light that would scatter my atoms across the cosmos. But the fatal strike never came. Instead of blowing my flimsy hull into oblivion, the navigation console sparked violently. A spatial tear ripped open right in the middle of my cramped, oil-stained cockpit. The air pressure dropped drastically, popping my ears, as three towering figures materialized out of thin air. These were not mere foot soldiers. The ornate armor, the sheer suffocating aura of dominance, and the terrifying biological traits marked them as the supreme leaders of their respective empires. And strangely, each of them was clutching a heavily armored incubator pod. To my left stood the sovereign of the Kalan race, a towering behemoth made of hardened magma and fiery tendrils, whose very breath scorched the paint off my bulkheads. In the center was the warlord of the Vorith, a nightmare of jagged obsidian dragon scales and eyes like twin dying stars. To my right lurked the matriarch of the Jari, a shadow hunter whose form seemed to absorb the dim emergency lighting, shifting in and out of the physical realm like a bad memory. Any one of them could have snapped my spine with a flick of their wrist. Yet they looked desperate. The Kalan sovereign stepped forward, his voice rumbling like an active volcano, speaking through the universal translator collar around my neck. "Human, we have no time for pleasantries, and you have no choice in this matter." I backed up against the main console, holding my hands up. "Listen, if this is about the illegal dumping sector I just passed, I can pay the fine. Just name the price." The Vorith warlord let out a guttural hiss, stepping closer. "We do not care about your trash, Atticus Ball. We care about survival. Our empires are facing total annihilation." It made no sense. These three factions had been tearing each other apart for centuries. Now, they were standing shoulder to shoulder in a flying garbage can. The Zari matriarch glided forward, her voice a chilling whisper that echoed directly inside my skull. "A targeted bioweapon has been unleashed upon our core worlds. It is a synthetic virus, engineered to specifically seek out and eradicate the royal genetic codes of our three species. It is highly contagious, 100% lethal, and it cannot be cured by our greatest medical minds. Within 72 hours, every member of our royal bloodlines will be reduced to liquefying organic sludge. She gently placed her armored incubator onto my navigation desk. The other two leaders did the same. The pods hummed softly, and through the reinforced glass, I saw tiny, fragile forms sleeping within. "These are our final heirs," the Kalan sovereign rumbled, his fiery gaze dimming with what almost looked like grief. "The last pure genetic hope of our respective empires." I stared at the three incubators, then back up at the terrifying titans. "And what exactly do you want me to do?" "I haul toxic sludge." "I am not a pediatrician." "You are human," the Vorith warlord stated, pointing a clawed finger at my chest. For centuries, the galactic community viewed humanity as a weak, unremarkable species from a dirt ball in the outer rim. But your biological makeup is an anomaly. The baseline human DNA constantly emits an incredibly specific micro-radiation, a bioelectric field that passively neutralizes the synthetic bonds of this virus. By simply existing near you, the virus cannot survive. The weight of the situation crashed down on me. They were not here to kill me. They were here to use me as a biological shield. "You will take them," the Zari matriarch commanded. "You will care for them. You will keep them alive until the bioweapon decays in our home sectors. A process that will take exactly 1 solar year." "1 year?" I choked out. "On this ship, with apex predator babies?" "We are establishing a pact of blood and void," the Kalan sovereign declared, slamming a heavy fist against his chest armor. "If you succeed, if our heirs survive the year, we will grant you the ownership of an entire resource planet. You will have wealth beyond the comprehension of your primitive species." He paused, and the temperature in the room plummeted despite the fire radiating from his skin. "However, if you fail, if even one of these tiny lives is extinguished while in your care, then our combined fleets will bypass the galactic treaties, set course for your solar system, and burn the planet Earth until its oceans boil away and its continents turn to glass. Do we have an understanding, human?" I looked at the massive cannons aimed at my ship outside the window, then at the 3 alien warlords, and finally down at the 3 sleeping alien infants. I swallowed the lump in my throat, realizing I had just become the highest paid, most terrified babysitter in the history of the universe. "I understand," I said. The 3 leaders gave a curt nod, activated their transport modules, and vanished from my ship. The space outside warped again, and the massive fleets disappeared into the void, leaving me entirely alone in the suffocating silence of the Black Belt, accompanied only by the soft beeping of 3 incubators. The first 48 hours of my new life as a galactic foster father were a waking, logistical nightmare. The moment the incubators popped open, I realized my rusted transport vessel was fundamentally unequipped to house apex predators, let alone infant ones. I had to immediately seal off the main cargo bay and pry up the heavy titanium floorboards with a plasma crowbar, hastily converting the pressurized trash hold into a multi-ecological nursery. My hands were blistered, my back ached, and the sheer claustrophobia of the cramped ship began to weigh heavily on my mind. I was trapped in a flying tin can with 4 alien babies who possessed enough combined destructive potential to level a small city. When the Vorith warlord's incubator hissed open, it did not reveal a single heir, but a pair of squirming, obsidian-scaled twins. The environmental controls were the first casualty of this chaotic new reality. The Kalan royal infant was a creature of living heat, resembling a tiny, chubby elemental of magma and hardened rock. The air was apparently too dry for his sensitive, fiery lungs. Every few minutes, he would let out a high-pitched squeak, followed by a massive sneeze that expelled a shower of white-hot sparks across the room. Within the first 2 hours, His sneezes triggered the emergency fire suppression systems on 6 separate occasions. The ship's alarms would scream with a deafening siren, and the overhead nozzles would douse the entire nursery in a thick, sticky layer of cryogenic fire retardant foam. I spent half my day wading through knee-deep chemical snow, trying to wipe the foam off the sputtering Kalen baby before his internal temperature dropped too low. Meanwhile, the Vorith twins were discovering the joys of teething. Unlike human babies who chewed on soft rubber rings, these little terrors possessed rows of serrated, diamond-hard fangs that were constantly growing. They crawled with terrifying speed on all fours, hunting for anything metallic to grind their teeth against. I turned my back for exactly 3 minutes to clean up another fire foam mess, only to hear the agonizing screech of tearing metal. I sprinted toward the engineering bulkhead and found the twins happily gnawing entirely through the primary conduit of the engine coolant distribution network. Toxic, pressurized liquid was spraying everywhere, and the core temperature gauge was rapidly climbing toward a catastrophic meltdown. I had to physically pry their jaws off the pipe and weld the breech shut while holding 2 thrashing dragon babies under my arms. We were roughly 90 seconds away from being vaporized. Yet, the Kalen sneezes and the Vorith chewing were manageable compared to the absolute panic induced by the Zari infant. True to her species, the little girl was a master of the shadows. Her default state was camouflage. She did not just blend in with her surroundings. She bended light around her tiny form, becoming completely invisible to the naked eye. To make matters worse, she loved the zero-gravity maintenance shafts hidden behind the main bulkheads. She would slip right through the ventilation grates and scurry along the ceiling like a ghost. I spent hours crawling through the cramped, dark access tunnels with a handheld static thermal detector, frantically waving the scanner around to pick up her faint heat signature. Just when I thought I found her, the thermal blip would dart away. It was exhausting, terrifying, and pushed me to the edge of my sanity. My standard galactic protocol manual suggested that when dealing with aggressive predatory species, one should install localized electric shock collars to enforce submission. It was the brutal, accepted method of taming wild creatures across the outer rim. I looked at the electric restraints sitting in my toolkit, then looked at the 4 little faces peering at me from the foam-covered nursery. They were not monsters. They were just children, acting entirely on instinct. I threw the electric restraints straight into the incinerator chute. Instead of using pain to break their spirits, I decided to lean heavily into the bizarre, stubborn patience I had learned back home on Earth. If I could not overpower them, I had to mentally engage them. I started by dismantling the ship's navigational subroutines and reprogramming the holographic projectors to create intricate, glowing logic puzzles on the nursery floor. The Vorith twins suddenly found themselves captivated by chasing holographic light sequences that required them to press specific panels in a coordinated sequence to catch their prey. Their destructive chewing ceased completely as they focused their sharp little minds on solving the riddles. For the Zari girl, I realized she was hiding because she felt exposed. I built small sensory deprivation tents out of spare thermal blankets and placed them in the corners of the room. I left a trail of glowing, synthesized protein cubes leading to the tents. Within 1 hour, she stopped sneaking into the dangerous zero-gravity vents and claimed the soft, dark tents as her safe zones, becoming visible whenever she felt secure. The biggest challenge was neutralizing their raw, aggressive energy. I raided my emergency ration supplies and began cooking artificial meals. The standard nutrient paste of the Transport Guild was bland and tasteless, which only frustrated their heightened senses. I tapped into my bioengineering background, mixing synthetic amino acids and heavy spices to replicate diverse, robust flavors. For the Kalen baby, I cooked dishes infused with pure capsaicin and metallic salts, replicating the fiery volcanic minerals of his homeworld. He happily slurped down the spicy sludge, and the sneezing stopped entirely. I established a strict discipline model based purely on a reward system. Good behavior earned them extra portions of the flavored meals, or an additional hour with the logic holograms. Bad behavior meant they had to sit quietly in the designated timeout circle. By the end of the second week, the alarms stopped ringing. The four deadliest biological weapons in the galaxy started treating a tired human garbage hauler like he was the center of their entire universe. The transport drifted deeper into the absolute center of the Black Belt, a region so densely packed with frozen dark matter and rogue celestial bodies that starlight simply ceased to exist. Out here, the navigation sensors were practically useless, blinded by the immense gravitational shadows of dead planetoids and the lingering radiation of ancient cosmic collisions. It was a graveyard of ambition, a place where the void felt physically heavy against the hull. Normally, this sector was the safest place for a ship trying to remain entirely unseen. But the comforting, rhythmic hum of my rusted engines was violently interrupted by a sound that instantly froze the blood in my veins. It was not the standard, rhythmic beep of a proximity alarm. It was a deep, resonating structural breach siren, before the primary radar could even register a blip on the screen. A localized kinetic shockwave rattled the entire vessel. The violent jolt sent unsecured mechanic tools clattering against the titanium bulkheads and knocked my maintenance scanner onto the floorboards. My main engineering console flashed a blinding crimson warning across the dark cabin. A military-grade stealth boarding craft had successfully clamped its magnetic tethers onto my outer hull. They had perfectly synchronized with my navigational blind spots, matching my velocity and trajectory with chilling precision. They were right on top of us, and I had absolutely no warning. I desperately pulled up the external camera feeds and felt a sickening drop in my stomach as the grainy footage resolved. The invaders were not random scavengers looking for scrap metal. They were mechanized mercenaries. This was a ruthless syndicate of cyborg cutthroats, infamous across the outer rim territories for stripping civilian ships down to the rivets and selling the surviving crews to the highest bidder in the underground slave markets. They must have picked up our unique energy signature back near the border station and tracked us silently into the dark zone. Their target was blindingly obvious. On the galactic black market, 4 living royal heirs from the 3 most powerful apex empires would fetch a bounty high enough to purchase an entire star system outright. I had to move faster than I ever had in my miserable life. I slammed my fist onto the master emergency lockdown switch, triggering heavy blast doors that dropped from the ceiling to seal off the primary ship corridors. I sprinted frantically into the makeshift nursery, scooping up the 4 infants as gently as my trembling hands allowed. The Kalen baby glowed with sudden, intense anxiety, his body temperature spiking dangerously. The Vorith twins hissed aggressively at the terrifying structural groans of the ship, their sharp fangs bared. The Zari girl immediately turned completely invisible in my arms, though I could feel her tiny form shivering violently against my chest. I carried them past the main engine room, tearing open a heavy maintenance hatch that led directly into the toxic gas filtration system, behind the massive chemical scrubbers. I had previously hollowed out a makeshift cryogenics chamber for extreme survival emergencies. It was incredibly cramped, freezing cold, and smelled sharply of sulfur and recycled exhaust. But its thick, lead lining heavily shielded it from external thermal scanners. I shoved them inside, looking into their wide, terrified eyes, illuminated only by the dim emergency lighting. "Stay completely quiet. Do not make a sound," I whispered urgently, sealing the heavy lead door shut just as a massive, deafening explosion rocked the front quadrant of the ship. The violent mercenaries had blown straight through the reinforced magnetic shielding of the starboard airlock. The internal atmospheric sensors screamed in a continuous high pitch as 3 massive figures marched purposefully into the ecological hold. They were hulking monstrosities of grafted alien flesh and heavy combat steel, wielding high-energy plasma cannons that painted the dimly lit corridors with an eerie, lethal blue glow. I crouched silently in the shadows of the upper catwalk, directly above the main cargo pathway, clutching a greasy manual override terminal. I was certainly not a trained soldier, but I was a resilient, deep space survivor, and this rusted ship was my personal domain. I knew every single corroded pipe, every pressurized valve, and every structural weakness. The lead mercenary stomped arrogantly forward, his glowing optical sensors scanning the empty nursery below, completely unaware that he was standing directly over a primary industrial waste flush valve. I gritted my teeth, held my breath, and yanked the heavy override lever violently downward. The reinforced titanium floor plates beneath his heavy combat boots suddenly retracted with a sharp metallic screech. Before the cyborg could even attempt to fire his weapon or activate his emergency jump thrusters, a highly pressurized torrent of raw, concentrated industrial acid erupted from the storage tank located in the lower deck. The dark, corrosive sludge hit him directly from below with the devastating force of a geyser. His heavy combat armor, specifically designed to withstand prolonged military-grade laser fire, instantly began to violently bubble and dissolve. The mercenary let out a horrific, synthetic shriek as the industrial acid rapidly ate through his complex servos and internal wiring, reducing his towering form to a smoking, bubbling pile of melted slag in a matter of seconds. The smell of melting metal and burnt synthetic flesh flooded the corridor. But my desperate tactical victory was horrifyingly short-lived. I had drastically underestimated the sheer brute force and reaction time of their unit leader, the mercenary commander, a towering giant whose biological body was almost entirely replaced by heavily armored hydraulics and thick carbon plating, did not even flinch at the gruesome, agonizing death of his subordinate. His advanced combat sensors instantly triangulated the exact source of the mechanical override signal. Without a single second of hesitation, he turned his massive plasma cannon toward the upper catwalk and fired a blinding, concentrated beam of pure thermal energy. The steel grating directly beneath my feet vaporized instantly into white, hot dust. I plummeted helplessly to the deck below, crashing incredibly hard against the solid steel floor plates. Blinding pain exploded in my left shoulder, radiating down my spine. But before I could even attempt to scramble away into the shadows, a massive, freezing cold steel hand clamped violently around my throat. The gigantic commander hoisted me effortlessly off the ground with a single arm, his glowing red optical visor burning a hole into my face. The hydraulic servos in his arm whined menacingly as his grip tightened, completely cutting off my air supply. I kicked wildly and thrashed my legs, my human hands tearing completely uselessly at his impenetrable armored fingers. My vision began to blur around the edges as oxygen starvation set in. With a mechanized, guttural grunt of pure disdain, he pulled his massive arm back and hurled my body violently across the long corridor. I flew through the air like a discarded rag doll and slammed brutally into the heavy engineering console. My vision flared completely white with agonizing pain as I collapsed heavily onto the cold floor, gasping desperately for breath, tasting copper blood pooling in my mouth. I tried to push myself up to stand and fight, but my broken body absolutely refused to obey my commands. I lay there completely paralyzed at the base of the control panel, directly in front of the concealed hatch, where the 4 royal infants were desperately hiding. The giant mercenary stepped casually over the bubbling, toxic remains of his comrade, his incredibly heavy footsteps echoing loudly like a death knell through the silent ship as he raised his lethal plasma cannon, pointing the glowing barrel directly at the center of my chest. My vision tunneled into a pinpoint of gray, the crushing weight of my own fractured ribs making every breath a shallow, agonizing gasp. The massive plasma cannon hummed with a lethal, rising frequency, its blinding blue core illuminating the grimy floor plates where my blood had begun to pool. I closed my eyes, resigning myself to the inevitable flash of oblivion. I had failed. I had failed the brutal warlords. I had failed the fragile lives hidden just inches behind my broken body, and the planet Earth would inevitably burn to glass. But the killing blow never came. Instead of the searing heat of a plasma discharge, the suffocating silence of the corridor was suddenly shattered by a sound that completely defied the natural order of the cosmos. It started as a low, rattling vibration echoing from the dark corner directly behind the toxic gas filtration system. It was a chorus of vicious, guttural growls. These were not the helpless, frightened whimpers of trapped infants. These were the primal, echoing war cries of apex predators whose territory had been violently invaded. Before the towering cyborg commander could even process the auditory anomaly, the air directly above his right shoulder began to shimmer and violently warp. The Jari girl materialized out of absolute nothingness. She did not just appear. She struck with the lethal precision of a coiled viper, launching her tiny, weightless form through the air. She landed squarely onto the heavy carbon plating of his neck, finding a microscopic fissure in the structural seal of his tactical helmet. She sank her razor-sharp, venomous fangs deep into the exposed synthetic mesh. The paralyzing neurotoxin, a biological marvel unique to her shadow-dwelling ancestors, pumped directly into the commander's central nervous system. The giant mercenary let out a gargled, panicked synthetic shriek as his motorized neck servos instantly locked into place, his entire upper body seizing violently. His heavy plasma cannon wavered wildly off target, scorching the ceiling panels, but he still gripped the weapon tightly. Then, the heavy lead door of the cryogenics chamber burst completely open. The Kalen royal infant stepped into the dimly lit corridor, no longer glowing with the terrified, erratic heat of a frightened child. His molten rock skin burned with a terrifying, controlled brilliance, illuminating the hallway like a miniature sun. He planted his tiny, magma-crusted feet firmly onto the deck, drew in a massive breath that sucked the oxygen straight out of the surrounding air, and unleashed a continuous torrent of blazing, high-intensity blue flame. This was not the chaotic shower of sparks from his sneezes weeks ago. This was a concentrated, blinding beam of pure thermal destruction. The intense fire washed over the mercenary commander's heavily armored right arm. The military-grade carbon plating glowed cherry red before the underlying mechanical joints simply liquefied. Liquid metal dripped onto the floor, and the heavy plasma cannon dropped from his useless, melted appendage with a deafening metallic thud. The cyborg, now paralyzed from the neck down and missing his primary weapon, staggered backward blindly, emitting a continuous loop of error codes and agonizing screams. But the assault was far from over. A blur of obsidian scales shot out from the shadows near the floorboards. The Vorith twins did not attack blindly. They moved with terrifying, synchronized tactical precision. They darted past his stomping, chaotic heavy boots, scaling his massive back like twin demonic insects. Bypassing his thick armor plates, they went straight for the exposed, glowing core energy cables, feeding power from his spinal battery pack to his life support systems. With their diamond-hard, newly formed fangs, the twins ruthlessly chewed through the thick, armored wires. Sparks showered the corridor as the heavy power lines severed completely. The hulking commander convulsed one final time before his glowing optical visor flickered and died completely. The massive, unstoppable killing machine collapsed forward, hitting the steel deck with an impact that shook the entire vessel. Completely dead and utterly defeated, silence rushed back into the battered corridor, save for the crackling of cooling metal and the heavy, ragged sound of my own breathing. I lay completely stunned against the engineering console. Across the galaxy, every known biological text dictated that the offspring of solitary apex predators possessed only two primal instincts when faced with overwhelming danger, which were to hide or to flee. Survival of the individual was the absolute biological imperative. Yet, these four alien children had completely defied 1 million years of genetic programming. They did not run. They had perfectly coordinated their unique, devastating biological abilities, working as a unified tactical squad to protect their fragile, fleshy human foster father. I forced my bruised, battered body to sit up, groaning in agony as I extended my trembling arms. The four tiny terrors immediately rushed over, their aggressive postures melting away as they pressed their soft, oil-stained bodies against my chest. The Zari girl purred softly, becoming visible only to nuzzle my chin. The Vorith twins licked the blood off my knuckles, while the Kalen boy carefully dimmed his heat so he would not burn my torn shirt. Holding them tightly, a profound, overwhelming wave of fierce pride washed over me. The warlords had sent them to me solely because my passive human DNA neutralized a virus. But looking at these little warriors, I realized something far more magnificent. The sheer empathy, the stubborn patience, and the unconditional protective love of a human being had fundamentally rewritten their nature. We humans were not physically strong, nor were we terrifying. But by teaching them compassion, I had successfully forged the most devastatingly powerful weapon the galaxy had ever seen. It took me 6 agonizing hours to haul the heavy, dissolved remains of the cyborg mercenaries out of the airlock and vent them into the infinite void. My body was battered, wrapped tightly in biomedical bandages, but the adrenaline still coursed coldly through my veins. Sitting back in the dimly lit cockpit, I plugged my primary diagnostic terminal directly into the ship's central mainframe. I needed to know exactly how the stealth transport had tracked us so flawlessly through the sensor blind spots of the Black Belt. As my tired fingers flew across the cracked keyboard, digging deep into the lowest layers of the navigation source code, I did not find a tracking beacon. I found something far worse. A chilling realization washed over me, freezing the blood solid in my veins. The ship was no longer under my control. Our flight path, which I had carefully plotted to skirt the edges of the dead zone, had been secretly and permanently bent. The autopilot subroutines were rigidly locked, completely overriding any manual inputs from my console. The rusted transport vessel was driving itself directly toward the absolute center of a Category 5 spatial radiation storm. It was a cosmic anomaly of unimaginable destructive power, a swirling, chaotic vortex of lethal gamma waves and crushing gravity that no physical matter could ever escape. We were scheduled to hit the brutal event horizon in exactly 48 hours. Once we crossed that threshold, the ship would be torn into molecular dust. I frantically traced the anomalous command string backward, hunting desperately for the origin point of the sabotage. The encrypted data logs did not lie. A highly complex military-grade computer virus had been seamlessly injected into my navigation systems. I checked the exact timestamp of the fatal infection. It was not uploaded by the mercenary hackers during the breach, nor was it picked up from a stray automated satellite. The virus was planted on my ship at the exact second the 3 towering Supreme Leaders had teleported into my cramped cockpit at the very beginning of this journey. The localized spatial tear they used to board my vessel carried a hidden, highly sophisticated data spike. It had instantly rewritten my mainframes while I was entirely distracted by their overwhelming physical presence and their terrifying threats. The scattered pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped together in my mind, forming a picture so horrifyingly brilliant, it physically took my breath away. There was no targeted biological weapon ravaging their homeworlds. It was all an elaborate, galactic-scale lie constructed to manipulate me. The real enemies were not synthetic plagues or greedy black market mercenaries. The true monsters were the 3 leaders themselves. They were not desperate guardians seeking sanctuary for the innocent. They were ruthless, calculating usurpers. They had clearly orchestrated the brutal, sudden assassination of the true royal parents to seize the supreme thrones for themselves. But, as long as the legitimate infant heirs remained alive, their treacherous grip on ultimate power was entirely vulnerable to sudden rebellion from loyalist military factions. However, murdering the royal children directly by their own hands would spark immediate, bloody civil wars across three separate empires. The galactic public would demand justice. So, the false kings devised the perfect, entirely untraceable purge. They intentionally handed the rightful heirs over to a random, insignificant human garbage hauler who operated in the shadows. They fed me a fabricated, flattering story about my unique human DNA, promising me a fictitious resource planet to ensure I would absolutely take the job without asking questions. Then, they secretly hijacked my navigation computer and pushed us straight into the deadliest, most isolated zone of the entire galaxy. They were allowing the raw, destructive forces of cosmic nature to completely vaporize the children, the ship, and the human witness. There would be no bodies to recover, no wreckage to analyze, and absolutely no trace of evidence left behind. It was a flawless political execution masquerading as a tragic, unfortunate accident in the void. A cold, suffocating silence filled the cockpit, broken only by the rhythmic, ignorant hum of the doomed engines propelling us toward our graves. I slowly stood up from the console, my broken ribs aching with every movement, and walked quietly back to the makeshift nursery. The four tiny, exhausted predators were huddled together in a deep, peaceful sleep, their small chests rising and falling in perfect unison. They had just fought so fiercely, ignoring their deepest survival instincts, to protect a simple human who was nothing but a disposable pawn in a royal slaughter. A dark, consuming fury ignited deep within the pit of my stomach. It was not a hot, chaotic anger, but a freezing, calculating wrath. The usurpers thought they had completely outsmarted the universe. They arrogantly believed they could use a human as a silent tool for their treachery, expecting me to simply roll over and die in the dark. I stared at the sleeping royal heirs, my human hands clenching into tight fists until my knuckles turned completely white. I silently swore a blood vow to the cold, uncaring stars outside my window. I would absolutely not let these children die today, and I would personally ensure that the false kings, sitting comfortably on stolen thrones, would pay the highest, most agonizing price imaginable for their monumental betrayal. Panic was a luxury I could absolutely not afford. The cosmic radiation storm loomed on the main viewport, a swirling, violent abyss of violet energy and crushing gravitational waves that tore passing asteroids into subatomic ribbons. The infected autopilot aggressively fought my every manual override attempt, rigid in its programming, dragging us steadily closer to the lethal event horizon. I knew I could not hack a military-grade virus in the seconds we had left, so I completely bypassed the digital interface. I ripped the primary engineering console open with my bare, bleeding hands, plunging a heavy plasma wrench straight into the physical safety regulators of the nuclear reactor core. The ship violently shuddered as I manually shattered the fail-safes. I pushed the rusted thruster manifold to 150% of its maximum design capacity. The structural integrity alarm screamed as the titanium hull began to literally peel apart under the immense pressure. In a blinding, chaotic flash of raw kinetic force, the overcharged engines tore a temporary, microscopic hole in the very fabric of space. We slipped through the quantum tear a mere fraction of a second before the radiation storm swallowed our previous coordinates whole. We emerged deep in the lawless outer rim, severely battered but miraculously alive. I spent the next 6 months completely gutting the external profile of my ship. I welded scrap metal and stolen military plating over the hull to permanently mask our original energy signature. turning us into an unrecognizable ghost ship drifting through the fringes of society. Utilizing the deepest, most encrypted layers of the galactic black market communication networks, I began my silent, methodical war. I carefully compiled the undeniable black box recordings, the raw telemetry data of the hostile boarding action, and the exact, traceable source code of the assassination virus. Piece by piece, I anonymously broadcasted the undeniable proof of the Supreme Leader's treason directly to the highest-ranking loyalist generals embedded secretly within the Kalan, Vorith, and Zari militaries. I planted the seeds of vengeance in the fertile soil of their own empires, allowing the absolute truth to spread like a silent plague among the honorable soldiers who had been deceived. 20 long years passed in the shadows. For 2 decades, the entire galaxy believed Atticus Ball and the royal heirs were nothing but vaporized cosmic dust. During those grueling years on hidden rim worlds, I did not just keep the children alive. I forged them. I taught them human history, the art of strategic patience, the devastating power of psychological warfare, and the unwavering value of mercy. Today, the grand ceremonial hall of the Galactic Alliance capital stood in absolute, breathless silence. I strode confidently down the center aisle, no longer a terrified garbage hauler, but a seasoned, scarred commander carved by 2 decades of deep space survival. I walked straight past the 2 long rows of heavily armored Alliance guards. The architecture around me was pristine, built of floating marble and spun gold, a stark contrast to the grease and blood of my past. At the far end of the immense grand hall, sitting comfortably on their stolen, towering thrones, the 3 usurpers stared down at me. They had grown old, complacent, and thoroughly corrupt in their absolute power. Their initial arrogant sneers rapidly melted into sheer, unadulterated terror as their fading optical sensors recognized my aging human face. Before the false kings could even shout a panicked command to their elite royal guards, the massive reinforced doors of the throne room slammed shut with a deafening boom. The loyalist armies, the very soldiers who had sworn to protect the usurpers, stepped forward in perfect unison and firmly aimed their high-energy weapons directly at the thrones. The traitors found themselves completely surrounded and outgunned by their own people. Then, the grand hall plunged into total darkness. The ambient temperature spiked and dropped simultaneously, creating a swirling vortex of atmospheric pressure. From the deep, impenetrable shadows directly behind me, the 3 most devastating forces in the known universe finally revealed themselves. They were no longer the helpless infants I had hidden behind a toxic filter. The Kalan air towered above the massive crowd, a magnificent, terrifying colossus of erupting magma and absolute thermal control. Every step he took left glowing, molten footprints on the indestructible marble floor. The Zari matriarch stepped seamlessly out of the void, her presence an overwhelming aura of lethal, predatory grace, her armor woven entirely from captured light and dark matter. Flanking them, moving with absolute, unified synchronization, were the Vorith twins. They had grown into massive dragons of impenetrable obsidian armor, their terrifying jaws dripping with crackling kinetic energy. They were the rightful supreme leaders, fully grown and forged in the harsh crucible of exile. They possessed the raw, terrifying wild strength of their apex predator biology, but more importantly, their minds operated with the ruthless, calculating strategic intelligence they had learned entirely from a human father. They did not roar blindly. They moved with cold, disciplined military precision, outmaneuvering the panicked defense forces without shedding a single drop of unnecessary blood. The usurpers were stripped of their royal regalia, dragged from their thrones, whimpering and broken. They were immediately sentenced by the loyalist tribunals to be exiled forever into the very black belt they had once used as a graveyard for their enemies. As the guards hauled the defeated traitors away, the Grand Hall remained entirely silent. Trillions of citizens watching the live broadcast, waiting for the newly crowned monarchs to speak. The massive Vorith heir, speaking for the United Twins and the entire Revenge Force, stepped forward. He did not address his vast, victorious armies, or the trembling politicians cowering in the galleries. He turned his terrifying, glowing eyes directly toward me. He raised a massive, armored claw, pointing it steadily at my chest. His voice boomed across the Grand Hall, echoing through the speakers of every ship and settlement across the entire galaxy. "Let it be known to every star system from the core to the rim," the Vorith declared, his voice trembling with profound respect. "The greatest strength in the universe is not violence, nor is it fear. True. Absolute power must always bow to the one who taught us what it means to possess humanity." Thank you so much to all our wonderful listeners for staying with us until the very end of this incredible journey. We would love to know where you are listening to this story from, so please let us know your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story entertaining and emotionally rewarding, please consider helping us out with just $1. You can donate easily by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on the screen, or by using the PayPal link provided in the description and the pinned comment. Your generous support allows our channel to pay our hardworking staff so they have the money to feed their families and continue creating even better, more thrilling stories for you to enjoy.